to the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on the Future Made in Australia bill and to follow the member for Reid, who has shared with us a remarkable collection of non sequiturs and logical inconsistencies as she grasps around for some kind of argument in favour of what is, in fact, a naive piece of interventionist policy which is premised on the fundamentally false assumption that ministers and bureaucrats can do a better job of predicting what the market might be interested in paying for than private sector participants. And I do just want to touch on the companies that she mentioned at the end of her speech, because we all celebrate Rode, which is a remarkable Australian company that's built a global position in microphones and in audio engineering. And you could mention a range of other companies that are successful Australian companies manufacturing and exporting and building global scale and global market share. You could mention Cochlear, with the position they've built up in hearing implants, over 30 or 40 years of sustained hard work based on research done in Australia, originally at the University of Melbourne, now based at the Hearing Hub at Macquarie University. You could mention CSL, which has similarly established a global position in particular market segments to do with plasma and other important medical components or elements of the medical value chain, based on distinctive expertise and using that expertise to build a global market position. Or you could mention earlier stage companies, and one that I would mention is Baraja, which for a period of time was based at CSIRO in West Lindfield in my electorate, which the two PhD qualified men who founded it took the idea of dense wave division multiplexing, which is well known in telecommunications, and said, we think we could use this to come up with an innovative way of doing LiDAR. LiDAR is the key component that is used in automated vehicles to sense the area through which the vehicle is driving. And their insight was that if you split the light wave into all of the different colour components, you can get much richer data coming back to the sensor. That idea of splitting is fundamental to the way that dense wave division multiplexing works. And indeed, there's been a whole research tradition in this in Australia, companies like Redfern Photonics going back 30 or 40 years. So let's be clear. Nobody is contesting the proposition that if you have companies that take distinctive intellectual property developed in laboratories or universities in Australia and use that to build a global market position that employs thousands of people. If you take CSL, they employ many thousands of people around the world. I think they operate in around 40 countries around the world. Nobody is contesting that that is a very good and desirable thing. What is being contested by this side of the House is the proposition that the best way to get to that outcome and to generate more such companies and to generate more prosperity and to employ more people and to build competitive positions in these intensely competitive sectors, that the best way to do that is to involve ministers and bureaucrats in developing things like Future Made in Australia plans that are suddenly going to find new insights and new ways and new market opportunities that those dunderheads in the private sector had missed. Deputy Speaker, this is not a new idea. This is not a new idea. There is a long list of disastrous attempts to do this kind of thing in countries around the world. We laugh now at the idea of 5-year plans setting out targets for the number of tractors to be built. That was a feature of the economy of the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s. We laugh now because that seems like such a foolish idea. And of course, most of the countries of Eastern Europe have now moved away from that model. Or we can look at China, which moved away from that model and recognise that a market-based approach was likely to be much more successful. But if you look at what essentially this government is trying to do here, Their big idea, their big breakthrough, is that somehow, by having ministers and bureaucrats here in Canberra coming up with these ripper plans, that you're going to attract more private sector capital and we're going to have a flourishing, 1,000 flowers will bloom across sector after sector after sector where those hopeless dunderheads in private industry have failed to date to capture the opportunities. Well, that shows a touching faith, and on any objective view, a naive faith in the capacity of bureaucrats and of governments. And the proposition that I want to put to the House this evening is that this is a bad bill and a bad policy that the opposition is opposing for three fundamental reasons. Firstly, whenever you have bureaucrats and officials and ministers making choices about where to put significant chunks of public money, there's a very good chance that money will get squandered and the outcomes for taxpayers will be dismal. The second point I want to make is that we have, in fact, a very good case study of exactly what can go wrong with the PsiQuantum episode that we've learned quite a bit about over the last few months, none of it encouraging, about how to take almost $1 billion of public money and, if I can put it politely, Deputy Speaker, splash it up against the wall. Because my confident prediction to you is that the taxpayer is not likely to get anything like 100 cents in the dollar back on that almost $1 billion, and there's every chance that almost all of it will disappear with very little to be received in exchange. And the third point I want to make, as many of my coalition colleagues have made very articulately and powerfully, is that there's a much better way to stimulate the economic and industrial activity that we all want to see, the growth that we all want to see. And that is to focus on getting the basics right. Cheaper energy prices, less complex, burdensome, expensive, difficult, non-globally competitive industrial relations arrangements, and getting inflation under control so businesses are facing lower operating costs. So let's turn first to the proposition that when you involve ministers and bureaucrats in setting out plans, you involve a lot of misallocation of resources, a lot of spinning of wheels, a lot of lengthy reports and plans being written by people who, I don't want to be rude, but they frankly have very little idea what they're talking about. And it is very evident in what's proposed here that there's a real confusion in the roles of different bureaucratic entities. We're seeing an expansion of the role of ARENA from research and development to now suddenly going into manufacturing and deployment, where apparently their expertise has been hidden under a rock for 10 or more years. Of course, it's equally troubling that the way this has all been set up is that the bill gives the Minister for Climate Change and Energy the capacity to allocate additional funding to CEFC at the stroke of a pen, and the government, under this bill, would be able to roll out almost $4 billion in an election year. So there's very little reason to be confident that this kind of top-down industrial policy is going to produce the targeted results. There's every reason to be confident that it will waste a lot of taxpayers' money. The Treasurer is going to decide whether a particular sector of the Australian economy deserves investment. Now, how likely is the Treasurer to be in having success in allocating capital? Capital allocation is one of the fundamental disciplines in business, and successful businesses get very good at it, and they have real disciplines in the way they do it, whether it is conglomerate-type businesses like a Wesfarmers or, of course, one of the examples beloved of corporate finance theorists around the world, Berkshire Hathaway. Those capital allocation disciplines are critical to generating a return. And I'm sorry to say this, the Treasurer is a fine fellow, but he has zero experience in this. He has zero experience. And so I say to Australian taxpayers, the money that's proposed to be spent here, you can have zero confidence in the people who are going to be allocating it. Let me turn specifically then to a case study that is before us right now of what happens when a minister gets excited about a particular investment proposal, in this case PsiQuantum, an American company, not an Australian company, an American company, based in Silicon Valley in California. PsiQuantum came to Australia knocking on the door in 2022. They had a ripper proposal that the Australian government and one or more state governments should put hundreds of millions of dollars into building what they claimed was going to be the world's first fault-tolerant, error-corrected quantum computer. And Australia was going to get the very first chance to have one of those, and specifically Queensland. Now, the semiconductors contained in that computer won't be built in Australia because they're being built in Dresden in Germany and in New York State under agreements already signed by PsiQuantum with a company called Global Foundries. And it's not as if the Australian government and the Queensland government are going to have any exclusivity here, actually, because just a few weeks ago the government of the United States, of the US state of Illinois announced that they too are doing a deal with PsiQuantum to build a fault-tolerant, error-corrected computer. This one will go into Chicago, and there's $500 million available to subsidise that. So this agreement that the Australian government and the Queensland government have supposedly done with PsiQuantum doesn't secure any exclusivity. But then, of course, there's all the process problems. How were PsiQuantum chosen? Why were they the ones who happened to knock on the door of the minister? And the minister has met personally with them on several occasions. He visited their premises in Silicon Valley. Why did they get this huge chunk of funding and a whole bunch of other quantum companies, actually based in Australia, founded by Australians, companies like Silicon Quantum Computing or Dirac or Quantum Brilliance or Q-Control, why didn't they get any of this money? And indeed, why is it that the best they got was several months later the government conducted an expression of interest process which, on any analysis, is a reverse-engineered sham, and the rules of which said that the participants were not allowed to speak to Australian government officials. Don't forget that PsiQuantum had been for months given the opportunity to speak with Australian government officials up to and including the minister. This is what happens when ministers give to themselves or are granted the power to splash around hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. It gets spent in ways that do not reflect a disciplined process or a fair process, and the consequence is, I confidently predict, that this money which has been committed to PsiQuantum is not going to produce the kinds of returns that the minister has been suggesting. And here's another prediction. According to the minister, this computer is going to start operating in 2027. I confidently predict that will not happen. No industry expert believes that that's going to be achieved by that date. Let me turn to my third proposition, which is there's a much better way, Deputy Speaker, if you want to encourage Australian companies to be innovative, to be successful, to export. Create the business conditions which make it more attractive for private sector businesses and investments to allocate capital, to put capital at risk. Get inflation down by controlling government spending. And rather than changing the industrial relations rules so that the crooks and thugs of the CFMEU can knock on the door, in fact, without even knocking on the door, march into workplaces all around Australia, reverse those disastrous changes. Make it easier to do business and impose fewer burdensome and costly and entirely globally uncompetitive industrial relations rules. Those are the basics. And then, of course, get the cost of energy down. The cost of energy was promised to go up. It will go down. It's going up and up and up. And in business after business, that is creating huge problems for our global competitiveness. So this fantasy notion that ministers and bureaucrats can pick winners that the private sector has missed is a recipe to waste a lot of taxpayers' money. We are root and branch opposed on this side of the House to what is a very bad idea.